Hello everyone. Today I am talking to Sumanyu Talwar. He is product head for customer returns in Amazon India team. He is an IITD alumnus and an ISB graduate, and a very good friend of mine from college days. We happen to be in the same department in IIT Delhi. Sumanyu has been with Amazon for last 8.5 years and has led logistics, supply chain, post-order customer experience, and various products. He has also been an ex-entrepreneur, building and expanding his herbal product startup to export into 13 plus countries. Hey Sumanyu, thank you
Hi,
for taking your time to talk to us.
hi Chetan. Thank you. Thank you for having me over.
Yeah, anything we want to add before we start?
No, I'm just excited that this is a good opportunity, and yeah, I would love to speak to all of you. And I don't know if I can speak and I can hear your comments, but please feel free to ask questions or anything that I should talk about in the chat window.
Yeah, yeah. Listeners, folks, please put in your questions in the chat box, and once we go through the discussion, we'll take up those questions, and Sumanyu will try to answer them. Okay. Let's start with talking about supply chain and logistics in general. So, what are the various domains within supply chain and logistics? If you can give a brief snapshot, that would be good for our listeners.
Okay. So supply chain, if I can put it simply, right, it's a very vast domain, and it can have very different connotations depending on what kind of business you are in. Um, and so, let's say you are in a transportation business, supply chain will largely revolve around, say, driver experience, customer experience in the front end to solving issues like routing, sorting, etc. In the back end. If you look at a warehousing business, it has a very different meaning to a lot of people, where folks are solving for inbounding issues to pick pack issues, labor issues, etc. Right? But given I've spent a lot of time in the e-commerce domain, and so for us in e-commerce, it's an amalgamation of a lot of these things, starting from transportation, warehousing. Inventory becomes a very important aspect of supply chain, where you're solving core issues around where to keep your items, how to fulfill them fast, how to get them back, etc. So just start thinking of supply chain as or product management in supply chain as an amalgamation or a very complex vector of, let's say, who your actor is, could be your sellers, customers, operators, etc. to what space you are or what problem you're trying to solve versus what metrics you're trying to solve for. So let's say if you're optimizing for speed, then all of these, how do all these things start interacting with each other, versus if you're solving for, let's say, uh, how do I get my returns back in the fastest form or the cheapest manner, then you're optimizing for certain different things. So all these aspects start to interact with each other. So yeah, that's in short about supply chain. But as I said, it's a very vast area. So as you start double clicking into each of these areas, you will basically see an ocean inside that.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. Supply chain is definitely a, a vast area. When you talk about it, it has operations, it has customer experience, everything amalgamated into it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
You obviously brought a lot of supply chain experience from your startup, because you were in the export for herbal products with your company, and you were managing a lot of supply chain there. So, did that domain knowledge help you to be a PM in the supply chain, or how important is the domain knowledge for a PM in the supply chain?
Uh, I mean, as a PM, right, or all of us who are PMs, we know our core job is to solve some hard customer problems, um, and whoever the customer may be. As I said, the end customer could be different in which space you're sort of operating in, and our job is to basically solve that through a set of softwares that can make their life easy. Now, To that extent, if you want to solve a problem for a particular customer, you should understand who your customer is and what your customer really needs and what that customer really goes through. And so, to an extent, domain knowledge is important, because that's how you will get very close to your customers. But does that mean that someone who only has the domain knowledge can solve that problem? No. A lot of times you learn on the job, you understand through data, through anecdotes, voice of customers, etc. So you will understand what your customers really need. And so, yes, domain knowledge is important, but can that be acquired? Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, fair point. That brings a very interesting question. So, so generally, when we talk about a generic PM, we see a lot of frameworks, processes, which a generic product manager applies in their day-to-day work. How does these processes or framework differ, or do they remain same for supply chain and logistics product management, or do you guys have a different kind of a framework for certain work when it comes to product management and supply chain?
Okay, there is honestly there is no difference. Uh, Beyond the nuances that each space brings, there is no difference for me. And I can speak about how we operate at Amazon, how we hire at Amazon. Our PMs are absolutely fungible, flexible across, and you will see a lot of people who've worked across domains. And I can talk about myself as an example. I mean, done supply chain work, done front end customer experience work, uh, in Amazon. And so, some, in fact, you will see some people move across domains as diametrically opposite as maybe advertising to supply chain, right? So, again, like I said earlier, at the end you are solving core problems, and our PM's job remains the same. How do you identify those complex problems? How do you break them down into smaller achievable tasks? How, through your BRDs, design thinking, etc., how do you execute it? How do you measure it? How do you flow all your insights back into your product and make them better? um, I can absolutely superimpose all of that into any domain that you operate in, and supply chain is no different.
Okay, so you mean to say a product manager maybe does not have a supply chain experience, but can still apply for a supply chain product management role and get through it
Absolutely.
and learn on the job, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So at the end of the day, it all depends on who is hiring. Do they want someone to operate from day one, or is there a time to ramp up? But if I look at a slightly medium term horizon, there is absolutely um, no stopping for any PM to operate in any other space. You need to learn the nuances. You need to learn the nitty gritties of that space. Like someone working on website experience, unless they know how to, run certain A/B experiments that you obviously don't need in certain other spaces, it will be hard. But again, those are skills I believe you pick up on the job and can become better at.
Okay. So when I think about supply chain, and probably some of our listeners, when they think about supply chain, they feel that it is very ops heavy, right? Because there is pickup, delivery, warehousing, right? It feels like a very operational field, right? Which I'm sure it is, right? But in that operational field, what is the scope for creativity? Are the workflows very defined, very in a very standard way, and there is no scope for tweaking, or things are already very well documented, and there is no scope for creativity, right? So, what are the key skills for a PM, which probably is needed in supply chain?
Okay. So if I can understand your question in two parts, is the supply chain role very ops heavy, and is there scope for creativity? To answer your first question, is it ops heavy? Not necessarily, right? Again, goes back. I'll go potentially back to the earlier point I was making. It all depends on the space you are working in, and who your customer is. If your customer is an operator, you have to be very close to ops, because that's where the problem you're trying to solve. Um, uh, or you may be solving, let's say, a topology problem for your company. Then you need to just work with loads and loads of data, and understand what customer demands are. So again, it just depends on the kind of problem that you're trying to solve. Some roles will definitely become ops heavy, but not all supply chain roles become ops heavy. Um, and so that sort of brings me to the next part of the question that you asked, Chetan, in terms of what kind of creativity is, or what's the scope of creativity in these roles. Now, it's an interesting word, right? Creativity, because depends on what you feel is creative. Now, if a PM feels building cool UX is creative, then yeah, no. I mean, in most supply chain roles, you are not going to have the same level of user experience being built as probably a customer facing role or a
Right.
website facing role, right? But if you're looking at creativity from a perspective of how do I solve this problem better than how it had been done earlier, either from a technology solution, either from a whole process change for that matter, there is there is tons and tons of scope for creativity. And
Cost
I mean,
optimization, time
absolutely.
optimization.
And see, now supply chains are not what they were earlier, right? At least in, let's say, India, where the scale is huge, we have different states. Each state has probably a different regulatory requirement. Um, if you transpose that to, let's say, what a Europe does, there are different countries. It's just, but it's one large geography, again with similar different taxation domains. So all I'm trying to say is the kind of problems that we solve here uh, are very easily transportable to a lot of different geographies, and that's where your creativity starts to come in. Depends on the kind of problem you're trying to solve, and I can potentially take an example um, of something that my team did about maybe 3 years back. uh, Amazon in India operates at what, 30, 40 warehouses, thousands of sellers, almost millions of different items coming into our warehouses. And you know sellers were actually just sending these items to our warehouses, and we just did not know whether the day they will send it to us, whether we'll have space in our FCs or not. uh, and Now, how do you solve such a problem? And these sellers are not from the same city. Sometimes we have a warehouse in, let's say, Guwahati, and the seller from Delhi sending a shipment to Guwahati, and then 6 days later, suddenly the truck is just standing outside for 3 days, and sellers don't know what to do. Or trucks are hounding on the seller, right? So, and at that point, we were thinking, how do we solve this problem? It's a problem that needs to be solved at scale. We can't just solve it manually through, let's say, tons of folks sitting behind and just manually giving appointments. And so we just looked at, say, hey, why can't we just have like a book my show kind of a solution where a
Mhm.
seller can absolutely see their slot, book it, and then that's confirmed. And so just think of it like a front facing problem. It's a very simple problem, but when you start looking deeper into it, there are many different types of items. There are these items take different spaces. Not every item can be stored in the same way. Each item has a different handling requirement for that matter. If I have to predict something 7 days down the line, I need to also understand how much stuff is coming in all my warehouses, how much is actually getting shipped out. And so the kind of technology solutions that we had to build was something very different. And today that product is now launched in about what, 7 8 different marketplaces where Amazon operates. So creativity can come from many different ways, if I can put it. It
Yeah.
just depends on what kind of solutions do you want to solve for.
Right. Right. So yeah, that brings me to the next set of questions. So what are the key skills which a PM should look to acquire in the supply chain?
um,
Is
what kind
is
of
it
skills?
more like data analysis? Is it a lot of is it a bit of machine learning as well, or is it more of the UX, which I think is not? But yeah, according to you, what are some of those skills?
Okay. uh, Again, let me take you to an Amazon context and how we operate. I think machine learning has become a very important aspect in everything that we do. Uh, uh, Even if let's say you have to solve like a delivery problem, you potentially can't take the same decision across. It may not work from a cost standpoint, and so machine learning becomes a very important aspect that folks should definitely get a hang of, and sort of a word fluency that we use, get fluent in what machine learning does. You don't have to go as deep as probably a research scientist is doing, but you should understand how it works and how you can bring those things into your products. Data is super important for any PM, I will say, not just for supply chain, for any PM, because at the end, you will build solutions that data is telling you something for. But again, I think a lot of PMs get bogged down by the ton of data that exists, and we start averaging out stuff. Uh, if you look at, let's say, data over the last 1 year and data is telling you a particular direction, we start looking at that and start taking actions. But what we need to start doing is start de-averaging a lot of that data, and let's say look at different cohorts, different customer sets, uh, just different stages in the life cycle of what your end customer is going to go through, and then build solutions that work across. And maybe some cohorts have very different requirements. So yes, data is very important, but how you use that data again is important. And in general, I will say learn basic PM skills, and that will help you pick up a lot of your supply chain pieces, and build that product mindset, if I can put it that way. Because when you look at a problem, even in the supply chain space, you should understand how I can solve this through technology, which typically, let's say, someone in operations who's seeing that thing day in, day out may not be able to take that step back and look at it from a higher view of saying, how do I solve this from a long-term perspective? How do I build this solution from a stage where potentially this space may evolve over the next 5 years? And then will my solution be scalable at that point in time or not? It's very important to build that general thinking of how a product manager should look at problems. Building that is also a very important skill set.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. And how often do people in product management in supply chain get to uh, talk to the customers? Because in this case, probably your customers are the warehouse managers, or yeah, who typically are your customers, and how often do you think interacting them is required?
It's very important to interact with customers, and anyone, and I know there are some folks from Amazon on the call and I can see their comments, but it's very important to talk to the customers and whoever your customers are, right? And I think we should just understand that just because we say supply chain doesn't mean your end customer is not in the picture. I actually might just be building a front facing solution in the supply chain domain for my customers to use. Let's say even like an invoicing solution might be built, right? And if my end customer needs to use it, I need to understand what they need. But even if I now talk about, let's say, our operators or our warehouse associates or my delivery associates or my sort center associates, go spend time on the ground with what they're doing. Listen to their voice, listen to their concerns. Unless we start doing that, you will never build good products or products that can actually solve the real need on the ground. So it's very, very important. And like I said, why I use the word Amazon is because in Amazon we are very, very particular about our the voice of our end customer, whoever that customer is. And in fact, we start most of our reviews with the voice of the customer. So it's that important for us.
And what you said makes sense, because as we said earlier also, that domain knowledge is something which is very important, and now supply chain domain knowledge is not very generic, right?
It
So
is.
unless people go on the ground, talk to these people, they won't understand the domain, they won't understand the problems they are facing, and
Right.
the solution might become very hypothetical.
Right. I mean, like, let's take a very simple problem, right? In India, so much is cash and delivery. But what happens to that cash? So that problem is like a very hard problem for any, let's say, a supply chain person solving that problem from a delivery associate standpoint is like a hard problem to solve. Now we know from a customer's perspective what happens. We just give the cash and give the change or whatever. But what happens after that? So go spend time, let's say, with the delivery associate and just go through that process and see where their pain points are, because at the end they're meeting like 50 per people, 50 customers in a day. Look at the amount that's collected. How do they handle that? Is it safe for them? Are there more digital payment solutions that can be built into your supply chain, etc.? So start thinking, let's say, from a cross domain also will really help.
Yeah, yeah, great. So let's slightly go deeper into probably some of the features you had built. So if you can give some examples of backend and some front end features which you have built or your team has built as a supply chain product manager, which will give our listeners a flavor of okay what kind of features are built by these PMs.
Okay. So one example I spoke about, something that touches our sellers, warehouses, transportation, and was across the back end and front end. But if I can give you just general examples and potentially not just what we built, uh, think about. I think front end is very easy for a lot of us to visualize, but let's just talk about some back end features, right? Let's just talk about transportation. A lot of you get items which, let's say, you've ordered a phone or any high value item, and you see an OTP along with it, and you also see it's in a tamper-proof bag. That's just another product teams have built, and how to smartly identify which items, which customer sets to expose that to. How does that information flow back? And even on returns side, I mean, returns is a space that's, while it looks very front end from, let's say, what we do, but there's a lot that goes behind the scenes on, um, let's say, if I have to pick up an item from a customer's doorstep, uh, I need to ensure that the right item is being picked up. But then the same item actually travels back to our warehouses and is processed. Now, unless I understand how those items are actually processed in the warehouses, I can't build solutions on let's say delivery associates app. So these are some of things that we built on let's say the returns side, that are very back end focused, but eventually have a very direct correlation to our end customer experience.
So, yeah, probably touching upon the future of supply chain and logistics, right? So, where do you think supply chain and logistics is headed? Right, we see already there are so many players in the Indian markets, and do you think it is already at a place where there is saturation and we can see consolidation among players, or do you still see a lot of scope for growth and innovation?
Okay. I mean, I can give you my personal opinion. There is still a lot to be done. Consolidation will happen, and it's just part of the whole evolution. But supply chains are becoming more and more complex. With either regulations or going cross-border, or just the whole being intertwined with different things. They are becoming more complex, and as they become more and more complex, they will need to be solved, by PMs who will have to innovate and provide the best-in-class experience to all the actors in the process. So, for me, it's I won't use the word tip of the iceberg, but it's just a long way to go before these things can work efficiently. But more importantly, I think as PMs in India, I think we should also not just look at some of these things that we are building as just for India, because the Indian market is, like I said earlier, it's massive in scale. It has its own set of challenges that, if you start superimposing some of those problems, you will see that they're potentially applicable to many, many other geographies, especially the emerging geographies across like Brazil, Mexico, Southeast Asia, etc. So start thinking of supply chain problems or any problems that you're solving from these marketplaces, and you will see it's a very long way to go in this domain.
Okay. And you solving for India, and probably you would have seen supply chain across Amazon's various other geographies as well. Is there a difference between geographies? I mean, is the supply chain product slightly different in Brazil versus USA versus India? Do you see those geographical changes as well?
It is different, but it's not completely different. Um, right? Again, where the differences start to come in are largely in the regulatory side of the business, right? And that leads to certain modifications that you need to do in your products. So let's say, if I can just simply talk about returns for a matter, right? Our returns processes are exactly the same. They move the same way back to our warehouses. We offer a refund in the absolute same way. But can I offer certain solutions out of the box in India versus the US? No. For example, in India, we don't have an option for a retro charge, versus let's say in the US, you have an option for a retro charge. All your credit cards will allow you that. Europe has a two-factor authentication in place. Brazil has some very stringent taxation requirements, even more stringent than India. So some of those aspects really start to change, and that's where, say, some flexibility in your products is very important, but the core product doesn't change, and that's where you can start superimposing a lot of that with certain modifications across marketplaces.
Nice, nice. Great, great. So thanks, Sumanyu. I think that was a lot of insights, and I hope our listeners were able to get a flavor of product management in supply chain. We'll quickly look at some of the comments and questions, and maybe you'd like to answer a few of
Yeah,
them in
yeah,
remaining
I
time.
can I can see some of them, and there's one question on, if you want to build a foundation of logistics and supply chain, how can you build those skills? I mean, again, maybe I've just answered that earlier, but go spend some time in that space,
Yeah.
either as a PM, either as any other role, and you will build that through experience. Some of these skills are very hard skills that just reading about them, doing probably courses about them may not as much help you that an on-job learning will give you.
Mhm. Got it.
Uh, There is a question from Arzu, and I know Arzu is also from Amazon. So hi, Arzu. Do you think doing MBA from a top tier institute helps you grow in a PM role, or work experience in the same domain will help you achieve the same? Uh, MBAs aren't necessary, and I know you will find many such examples where most folks are MBAs, but I can tell you ton of people who've not done MBAs and are brilliant product managers across. So I think
I'm
where
not an MBA. I'm not an MBA, though I don't know whether I'm a brilliant product manager or not, but I'm
I
not an
yeah,
MBA.
Chetan, I've known him for long. He's not, and he's a brilliant PM. But I think where people start associating the two is only because maybe an MBA gives you, over time you get exposed to different facets of, let's say, doing business, either it's finance or marketing or whatever, and you start understanding customers better. You start understanding business problems a little more better. But does that limit you from growing into a strong PM? Absolutely not. So I wouldn't really, um, put a lot of weight on that. Uh, there's a question on what's the better approach, data driven or data backed? Uh, aren't the two same? I don't know if maybe you can ask, like, write a clarification, but all the insights are basically coming out from a set of data, and then obviously data will back what you built, because at least, let's say, most experiments that you will launch, most features that you will launch will go through some level of A/B testing. So if, in that sense, does that help you? Is that the data back that you were talking about? Absolutely. It's very, very important to ensure that you measure hard on every product that you build, because that will tell you whether what your hypotheses were, whether they are in the right direction or they are not in the right direction, and if you need to make certain tweaks. And even, let's say, 6 months down the line, a year down the line, you only using those parameters, you will know whether what you built is actually working as planned or not.
Yeah, I think analyzing data, being data driven, helps you come up with those hypotheses, right? And then you back those hypotheses by running experiments, doing real time testing, and then taking the decisions for a longer term. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, role that air cargo plays in supply chain, it's a very important aspect of Amazon. How much of this is domain knowledge driven and how much of this is helpful? Like it's a very specific domain. Like potentially, I've never been close to that space, and I know it's going to be very hard for me to solve a problem in that space. So, and then there are folks who've been there, in that industry for ages, and they understand the problem very well. So, um, goes back to the point. If I tomorrow want, if I'm, let's say, I'm very passionate about that problem and I want to solve, I'll probably just go take up a role in that team um, and just spend time. Without spending time, that space is will look challenging and daunting, and it's not that straightforward. But if your question is how much of that is very important for you to be successful in the e-commerce domain, it was the last part of your question, then no. I mean, e-commerce, like I spoke about, in the supply chain space, there are 2,000 problems that Amazon is potentially solving at one point in time. And so you don't potentially have to just solve that problem, and you can solve any other problem that's out there. Um, there's potentially a last question. Can you give me some examples of OKRs that a PM in a supply chain solves for, both from a customer angle and efficiency angle, and request to build a first principles overview of supply chain? Okay. Uh, when you say OKRs, I'm assuming these are just uh, KRAs or
Yeah,
any.
KRAs goals. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
So again, from a customer angle, from an efficiency angle, a PM in a supply chain could be again solving different problems. Let's take an example, right? On let's say transportation, forward delivery. How many of my shipments are getting delivered on time? Or let's say on my refunds or returns, how much time am I spending on the doorstep? From a, let's say, a backend perspective, if I just look at my returns and I say how many of my returns that I picked up are actually in the condition that I wanted them to be, or can I sell them again, or do I have to just liquidate them? So there are, or again, depends on the kind of problem that you're trying to solve. Your KRAs will come, and again, it's not a PM specific; it's a business specific KRAs that become more important, because at the end, a PM is solving a business problem. So if you want to just look at your KRAs for your products, you could just talk about, um, you know, what's the latency for that matter, right? For my product, those are just very technical KRAs that you can potentially have. Um, so it depends on what side of the problem you're trying to solve. Uh, any books, offline courses, I'm potentially not a good person to answer that. And I didn't want to, Chetan, maybe you are much closer to them, and if you can answer them. Uh,
yeah. I mean, to very it's because supply chain, as Manu said, is a very specific domain, right? If you have to learn about it, you have to be on the ground. Probably you can read about it on the internet, but every problem probably has its own nuances. So yeah, and in general for product management, there are tons of literature out there, but to build a knowledge of supply chain, you need to get in there and work in the field, and then probably you'll be able to build that domain knowledge.
Thanks, Chetan. There is actually one more question on, is a PM supposed to be skewed towards data skills or technical skills? I'll say both. Um, and you don't have to be a master of either, uh, but if knowing these are very, very important skills for any PM to scale. uh, because it's only when you understand some bit of technology on how technology works. Again, it's not like saying I'm an engineer. I'm not an engineer, but do I understand how technology works? I need to develop that understanding to start thinking on how can I solve this through technology. And same goes through for data skills. If I can't dissect my set of data, and I can't look at a problem from a very, let's say, grounds up perspective, it will be very hard for me to go beneath the surface, and I will keep scratching the surface and looking for solutions. So it's very important to understand what you want, um, and hence building these fluencies across will only make you a very very strong PM, a very well-rounded PM, if I can answer it that way.
There's one more question from Prajakta. What is the key skill that differs PM in supply chain?
I think, yeah, I sort of answered that earlier. I will say nothing much, barring the domain that in which you're working out on. See again, and I know where some of these questions might be coming from. So let me give you an example, right? So let's say there is a big organization within Amazon which is solving just, let's say, inventory problems, and PMs there are solving and are working with, uh, I don't know size, but gazillions of rows of data, right? And so their skill sets are very important than potentially someone solving uh, a driver experience problem, right? Or a speed problem or a returns problem. It again, it's not the supply chain or a non-supply chain that is making the skill sets different. It's the core business problem that you're solving is making the skill sets very different. And on top of that, a PM is very similar. But if you have to solve that problem, you have to be, you know, you should understand that space, and you need to be able to contribute to that space. For that, you need to build some of those skills. Now, if my inclination is not towards working with so much data, I potentially may never be able to solve some of those problems myself. And there are other PMs who will do much better job than potentially me to solve that. Versus vice versa, you could look at other problems which some other PMs may not be able to solve, and you may be able to solve. So it's not supply chain versus others. It's just the space, the business problem that you're solving that starts defining or differentiating with the different folks.
Yeah. So if I have to summarize, there is no entry barrier to getting into supply chain product management. But yeah, there is. If you want to succeed in that role, you need to understand the domain, get a grasp of domain, and understand the key problems you want to solve for in that domain, and that's how probably you will become successful in that domain. But yeah, most of you, I think your questions are towards entry barriers, but there are no entry barriers as such to get into product management in supply chain as versus other roles. Yeah. Great. So
Thank you.
thank you, Sumanyu. It was great hosting you and learning about supply chain and logistics. And thank you everyone for joining us. Hope you found this useful. If so, please share it, comment, like, share on your LinkedIn, and this will motivate us to bring you more such stories, domain specific stories from product management field. Okay. So yeah, till we meet again, stay safe, take care, goodbye, have a nice weekend.